we're not talking enough about how we need to protect our patients from this industry. It's really based on exploiting people's anxiety and the fact that they don't really have an objective, trusted resource to go to for brain health.
Welcome to the Strokecast. A Generation X stroke survivor explores rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand.
Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 81 of the Strokecast. You know, I'm not sure exactly where I first encountered Dr. Karen Sullivan, but I think it was probably through Instagram. But regardless, I'm glad I did encounter her. She was fascinating to talk to. And actually, we chatted for about 20 minutes before we even started recording this episode. We were scheduled to go for an hour, and I think we ended up going for a total of about an hour and 20 minutes. So, as you can imagine, I had a great time chatting with Karen. Dr. Sullivan is a neuropsychologist and the genius behind the ICFYB community. I Care for Your Brain. It's a collection of Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube resources that's really aimed at helping stroke survivors and others with brain problems manage their conditions, recoveries, and really to live the best lives they possibly can. She does regular Facebook Live videos on topics like post-stroke depression, neurofatigue, the nature of the brain and brain injury, what exactly is a cerebellar stroke, what happens in a cavernous angioma, how do you take care of a caregiver, and more. You can check them out by following the links to Facebook and YouTube over at strokecast.com/Karen. She also just released a workbook called the Interactive Stroke Recovery Guide and was generous enough to send me one. It's a workbook that allows stroke survivors and their families and caregivers to really more effectively navigate and manage the sometimes overwhelming world of stroke recovery by keeping track of goals, appointments, symptoms, and just all sorts of other things that we really need to write down and that really are part of everybody's unique stroke comeback journey. So now, let's meet Dr. Karen Sullivan. So Karen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, Bill.
I know. We've been talking for a while already, and I just really love the energy and enthusiasm here. So have you always wanted to be in the medical field?
Well, I would say I've always known that I would be in the helping field. And when I found out that you could really be in a helping field that also was medical, I was delighted. That's why when I learned about what neuropsychology was and how it really offered people a care partnership, I was kind of hooked very early on. But I grew up in a house with my mother being a social worker and just kind of always having in our family culture a very strong belief in helping other people and, making sure you're treating others as you would like to be treated. So it was kind of just built into me from like a family systems point of view. And then when I started to learn about the brain, of course, it's one of the most fascinating subjects, but really it's been the people that I've met along the way that have really firmed up the commitment, people's ability to adjust and adapt to all these different things that can go wrong in the brain. Still to this day, all these years later is, my best inspiration. It's just amazing how strong people can be when they have to be.
Yeah, it really is. And, what I think is interesting about that is how you've come to this field then from that perspective, from that people first perspective. Most of the medical professionals, it seems, that I talk to and that I ask that question of, they come to it from, yes, wanting to help people, but also from first being excited and enthusiastic about the science of the biology and the way systems work together and the math and the whole tech background that then translates into medical. And not that there's anything wrong with that. I just think it's interesting how those approaches come about for how people choose their vocation.
It is, definitely. Well, for me, I was really brought into the world of the brain through my grandmother's experience with Alzheimer's disease. And as a teenager, when she started to forget things and think we were over at the house when we really weren't. I had no idea that it was plaques and tangles in her brain and degeneration of her medial temporal lobe that was making that happen. I just saw it through the lens of her having a decline and how hard that was for me and my family. So over time, then when I started to get access to the information and the science, it was like it just illuminated the human side of the story. So part of it, I think, is just the way the information came to me. I saw how it affected the person first, and then later kind of filled in the pieces with science. And so I think that's kind of though how I've come full circle today to getting back to being in the community and trying to help people in the kind of way I do now through the Facebook Lives and trying to write the stroke recovery guide is definitely making sure I'm respecting how much things in the brain are affecting the person. I think you do have to know all the science and, there is so much amazing evidence-based information out there, but the reason I chose neuropsychology is it really does try to put the person first. And that's one of my concerns, is that in the world of brain healthcare is that people in general get too little access to brain health experts. But when they do, they're very strict medical providers for them. I mean, I'm kind of taking the world of rehab professionals out of it, like neurologists and neurosurgeons. It's very objective and it's based on what you can see and what you can test. And a lot of the things that I care most about, cognition, adjustment, psychology, they're subjective. You can't necessarily test them in that same way. So I'm just worried that, all of those doors aren't getting opened, which there's a lot of treasure behind those doors, but that's what neuropsychology really offers to people. But I'm not sure enough people know exactly what it is we do or have access to us.
I think that's really interesting when you talk about trying to understand what your grandmother was going through. The only other stroke in my family was one of my grandmothers had a stroke back in the 70s, at which point I became a wonderful little girl to her. But it was one of those things where as a kid, I didn't understand what was going on or any of the details. I just saw it as this old lady who was, going through a decline and in a wheelchair now. And it's now as I've learned more about stroke and started asking some questions about that I start to understand, oh yeah, she was actually dealing with aphasia and she wasn't in overall cognitive decline. She just lost her language. And oh my, that must have been incredibly frustrating for her.
Right, exactly. And so that's the thing then, like when you go beyond a family member and you start to do it for a job, you collect all of these human stories that even now, if I learn about something new in the brain, I can tie it back to somebody that I've known or helped to take care of. So after my grandmother, I did in-home care for maybe about 4 or 5 years and then worked in all sorts of kind of facilities and was an activities director and a co-director of an adult day health program for people with memory loss. And there's just that's what really sticks with me and is in my heart every day is knowing a person who's lived through this brain disease or this brain disorder. I often don't think of like, this very specific type of stroke. I'll think like, oh, right. Ed, like the person's experience comes to mind more so than the neurological deficit that they had.
That's a valuable perspective that we don't often hear. I know last year we talked with Whitney Moran, who is pursuing her degree now as a stroke survivor. She's pursuing her degree in neuropsychology because her own experience with the lack of services in the hospital. What is the typical path for somebody to go ahead and pursue psychology and then specialize in the neuro aspect of it?
Yeah, it's a very long path. I actually listened to that podcast with her. She was awesome.
Yeah, she's fantastic.
It's, typically you start off with a bachelor's degree in psychology, but really the bachelor's can be in anything, and then master's and then doctorate. And so you can either have a PhD or a PsyD. one of the issues is how competitive it is to get into these programs. So in the world of graduate school, veterinary school is actually the most competitive, followed by clinical psychology and then medical school. So to get into a clinical psychology program, nowadays you're looking at about, for the competitive schools, about a 1 in 800 person shot.
Wow.
So yeah, it's tough. And so you have to do a lot of research, know the right people, gather some clinical skills. But then we are in kind of a general psychology program, which has a specialization in neuropsychology. So you do that for about 5 to 6 years. And then you have the doctorate, but then you have to finish up the clinical work in order to get licensed. So then we do a year of internship, and then we do 2 years of a postdoctoral fellowship. And then you can sit for your license to be a psychologist. But the fun doesn't stop there. When you're a neuropsychologist, you want to get your board certification from the American Board of Professional Psychology. And that is about a 2 to 3 year process. So it's kind of like we have all these hoops to jump through, but really we do it because we want to assure the public that we have a certain level of expertise. And when we claim to be a neuropsychologist, it's because we have the education and we have the training, and we're coming at the study of brain and behavior from the position of an expert, because anyone can be claim to be a neuropsychologist. It's kind of like, anyone in the world can claim to be a counselor or a therapist. You can just put up, a sign outside your door and say, this is what I do. So we want to have that ABPP after our name, so people know that we're actually legitimate, well-trained neuropsychologists.
So somebody who's looking for a neuropsychologist should be looking for that ABP for those 4-letter designations. That will definitely be in the show notes.
Exactly. And you can actually go on Google and put in find a board certified neuropsychologist, and the ABPP website will come up, and you can put in your zip code and it will connect you to the closest person. And most insurance companies will let you have one evaluation a year. We are assessment-based providers, meaning that we use paper and pencil tests to infer the function of the brain. But some of us do also do counseling or cognitive rehab, maybe a little bit higher level than maybe you might get. Higher level, not meaning better, but just for someone who has, quote, more mild or cognitive deficits, we do cognitive rehab, cognitive retraining, those kind of things.
Do you have any idea how many neuropsychologists there are in the United States under that designation?
Yes. Well, I can tell you in North Carolina, where I am, there's about 30. And in South Carolina, there was 2 last I checked.
Wow.
But probably around the country, I think we're hovering at maybe around 900.
Wow. So that is, at 900, that is about roughly 1 per every 1,000 stroke survivors a year in the U.S.
Exactly.
Or actually not even stroke survivors, but stroke survivors and victims combined.
Right, exactly. And that was really what prompted me a few years ago to go from just being in my world of my private practice in North Carolina to developing an outreach education program, because I was very concerned that people didn't have access not only to the personalized evaluations that we do, which is, to me, the ideal way to really understand your unique situation and what will uniquely get you better. But also, we are huge educators. That is really at the heart of what neuropsychology offers people. Is we really believe that education is empowering, and that patients have a right to understand exactly what has happened to their brain. And we get nervous that people don't get that in the acute medical side of the house with a stroke, either because those medical professionals are very focused on medical stabilization and making sure you don't have another stroke. They don't really see a lot of their jobs as preparing you for leaving. They're focused on, getting you well when you're there. And of course, in rehab, that's a little bit different. And they do want to make sure, of course, you go home and, you're prepared to resume outpatient therapy. But, the psychology and the adjustment and education, that's not necessarily a big priority. And so if you look at the research, there's staggering statistics. About 95% of stroke survivors report having a significant unmet care need. And for most of those people, they're saying it lies within education and psychological support, which are really the two things that neuropsychologists offer people. And so I thought, well, I'm limited in my day-to-day medical practice. I can only see, one patient per hour. So I really need to move from a one-on-one model to a one-to-many model. And so I started doing talks in my community on science-based brain health, and I still do those to this day, and that's awesome. But I thought, here we have this free model with Facebook and social media, whereas if I start offering these weekly free brain health lectures, I'm going to be able to reach thousands of people. And that's exactly what's happened. So we're going on almost our second year of doing those once a week. And it's just been amazing. The people that, it's honestly both very positive and also very sad, because for some people, my lectures are the only time they've ever learned about, their cerebellar stroke or their thalamus, or, talked about how symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder can come along with stroke. And so there really is just this huge need out there for education. And on my Facebook page, I Care for Your Brain with Dr. Sullivan, it's brain health in general, right? And so about 2 years ago, more and more folks with stroke were reaching out to me. And so I started to join some of the Facebook pages that were focused on stroke. And there was one in particular called Young Stroke Survivors. And I just would be on there occasionally and trying my best to just support and give information. And it just struck me that almost everyone who was asking for information was asking for relatively basic information, like, I don't know what to do to get better. I don't know how to not live in fear that I'm going to have another stroke. And I thought, I have to just put together some kind of document that just has some guidelines that I can offer people to be able to find their way a little bit easier. Because it just strikes me as so unnecessary that people are out there reinventing the wheel with recovery, and I think that's why podcasts like yours are so powerful, because what I think you're trying to do, what I'm trying to do, is shorten that time from someone having their own personal issue, having their stroke, to figuring out what to do about it. Long-term stroke care is really poor in our country. We really aren't giving people a roadmap on exactly what they should do in order to get better.
Absolutely. And, it's fantastic that Facebook just has this platform to make these resources available, between what you're doing with the Facebook Lives. And by the way, folks who haven't been through that, Facebook Live is a platform where a speaker can go ahead and share their thoughts and their comments, and it is available for viewing later. So it's great if you can be there when it's happening, but you don't have to be. You can still go ahead and consume it. And while it is live, while it is happening, you can go ahead and make comments, provide feedback, and ask questions. So it's a great platform there. And at the same time, it doesn't turn on your webcam as an audience member. So you don't have to worry about accidentally broadcasting yourself. And between that platform and between all of the different forums, and, that Young Adult Stroke Survivors Global Network is a great one. It's great that it's there. But you're right. The questions that I see coming up in those groups are, I had my stroke 6 months ago and my arm feels really tight. Is this normal? There's just so much of this stuff that's so basic. And by the way, if you're listening for the first time, yes, that is normal. It's called tone or spasticity, and it's really super common, and there's treatment available.
And even taking a step back, Bill, like where, I was never told where in my brain I had my stroke. I see that in my practice, people coming in and they'll say, they'll have a spouse with them who was perfectly aware the whole time. And the spouse will say, yeah, I can't remember them ever saying the word cerebellum, or I don't think I've ever heard that word basal ganglia before. So sometimes I don't know, is it just that that information isn't getting communicated? Is it just that the context, you're pulled in a lot of different directions? You've just been through something really stressful. Sometimes I think people do get the information, but they don't take it in. But it's just, the idea in having it all written down in a comprehensive guide is that when people are ready, the information is there. It's not like there's this moving target of the window of, when can we get to the bedside? Because I was a inpatient rehab neuropsychologist in my last academic job at UNC Chapel Hill in the inpatient stroke unit before I left and kind of broke off to go into the world of private practice so I could do my own thing. But it was really hard to find time to meet with people and families in the inpatient setting, because I would go to the bedside and, they had to get a CT scan, or, we're sorry, the physical therapist had to change the appointment. It's not in many programs built into the musts of the therapy day. It's in general, the adjustment and the psychology of stroke. Unfortunately, I think it's put below the needs of the more quote unquote medical pressing issues, all of the physical stuff that you can see, and some of that stuff is valid because we need our physical functions to be able to get back those basic activities of daily living. But as a psychologist, I would argue that, people's stress level and their anxiety and the psychological trauma that's come along with the stroke is just as relevant to recovery as getting your arm back.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of that, some of that hospital culture. I mean, for the fantastic care that I got in the hospital I was at, they did not have a neuropsych program. That was a part of that. The closest I had was the speech language pathologist who came in to do my cognitive assessments. But it is definitely something that's there. And I think what's really interesting about this book that you've put together is we're used to seeing a lot of the different books that are out there in the stroke recovery field, which are more of the memoir-based book or the broader assessment of the different things that can happen in the brain from almost an academic perspective. And, and they're fantastic books that are out there,
Right, like Stroke of Insight, right? Like
exactly. Stroke of Insight, Healing into Possibility. Christine Lee's Tell Me Everything You Don't Remember, Ted Baxter's Relentless, Pete Smith's book, Impact. So there's all of these books that are out there. Your book is more of a workbook. It's an 8.5 by 11 big thing to work through with fewer pages, but less about a specific story. And, in some respects, it takes me back to the workbook that would go along with the textbook back in school.
Right. Well, you know what Joe from Neuro Nerd said? He said it was like a stroke recovery highlights
That's
magazine.
Right. That's right. I was looking for the Goofus and Gallants section.
Right. Oh, I used to love that. I used to call it Gallant for some reason. But, it's very purposeful because me and my collaborator, Carrie Fry, who's an award-winning graphic designer who did all the visuals, we wanted it to be very user-friendly. Kind of my whole interest is making academia and clinical medicine come to life and actually mean something and have an impact. And I think the way you present the information is critical, via the way you talk about it, your word choice, kind of the hierarchy that doctors can put out there. I'm the all-knowing, white coat professional, and you are merely the person who has lived through it. The visual part is that's part of what grabs people's attention and helps organize the information. So on one hand, I like doing things that are visually appealing because of my audience. People with brain health issues do become, many times when there is a speech or a language issue, you rely on other types of cues to get your information. And so it's important that we think about color and size and all that stuff to make the information more digestible to the brain. But it also really lends itself to the interactive nature of the guide. And that was really our biggest challenge was, on one hand, we know that, there's basically two types of stroke, right? So you have an ischemic stroke, which is a blockage, and a hemorrhagic stroke, which is a bleed. And On the other hand, we know that every single person's brain is different from birth. Every single stroke is slightly different. Every single recovery is different. So how can I create a recovery guide that both speaks to the universalness of stroke and stroke recovery, but is also individualized enough where each person can really maximize the recovery guide to get the most out of it for them? So the compromise we kind of came up with was, let's really look through the research literature. And this was a process that took us about 2 years, and really figure out what are the top 10 rules of rehab that science tells us really actually work. I'm really big into evidence-based communication, because I'm fighting all the time against this brain fitness industry with it's too good to be true claims, $8 to $10 billion worth of supplements and brain games that we know do nothing. And, neuropsychologists, neuroscientists, we know this, but yet we're not talking enough about how we need to protect our patients from this industry. It's really based on exploiting people's anxiety and the fact that they don't really have an objective, trusted resource to go to for brain health information. So if you're motivated and you're anxious and someone gives you a product that's really expensive and has a lot of big claims behind it, people fall prey to that. And so I'm really trying to come at it from much more of a science-based perspective. So, for 2 years, looking through the research literature on the animal model, on coping, on neuroplasticity, and trying to distill what are the top 10 things that have the most proof that actually work. So that's kind of the heart of the guide. But then it is interactive. And I think that's where a lot of the visuals come from, because we have behavior trackers, we have journal prompts, there's motivational cutouts, there's thank you cards to give to other people. And the whole idea is, you write in the guide, you keep it with you, you contribute to it, you reflect on it. It really is a place where you can bring it to your doctor's appointments. There's scripts in there for how to advocate for the best care. Doctor's appointments are shrinking in terms of time. I mean, I wonder, the last time, Bill, if you were comfortable sharing, that you went to, say, the neurologist, how long was that actual appointment? Okay, so you shared with me that your stroke was almost 2 years ago. Is that right? So are you saying that you've seen your neurologist twice in 2 years? Right. So what I know about you is that you are extremely hardworking in your recovery. And so, what I worry about is what are folks who maybe have different post-stroke impairments than you, if there is a cognitive issue, or they don't have, whatever, the support, the family, the money to put all those pieces together for them and do that self-advocacy work to get to voc rehab, to get to outpatient speech therapy. Right. There's just so many people out there who are going to the doctor once or twice, the neurologist after the stroke, and, basically there's nothing else we can do for you, call me if you need me kind of thing.
And one of the things that's been interesting too is when I go back to my PCP for follow-up care, my primary care physician. In the United States, your primary care physician is generally the main point of contact for all of your medical care, who then refers you out to other specialists as appropriate. But I find I am educating my PCP on stroke research and things like that. And what's interesting is, in my experience, it was the neurologist post-care who was actually able to articulate first why my high blood pressure caused my ischemic stroke. And it was, and he's the one who explained, I'm going to be on a statin and a Plavix for the rest of my life. Even if your cholesterol is under control, the studies show that that even with healthy cholesterol, staying on a statin reduces your risk of an additional stroke. But, a lot of other folks just didn't have that background. And beyond that, a lot of my care stroke-specific care has all come from my physiatrist, who also has been absolutely fantastic. But I still talk to stroke survivors now who are 5, 6, 7 years after stroke, and they have no idea, let alone what a neuropsychologist is. They have no idea what a physiatrist is.
Right, Absolutely. And really, your two best care partners, as far as I'm concerned, are physiatrists and neuropsychologists. In part is because I think we both take a whole person approach. I mean, when you go to see the physiatrist, they're not just looking at, your walking. They're looking at the tone, the reflexes, the nervous system connections. They're really systems-oriented providers. That's what neuropsychologists do. We're just trying to take in broader systems, right? The psychological system, the cognitive system, the social system. We're trying to really get into those worlds and understand, if there's been any impairments there. I've had many people who come to see me who don't realize that they maybe have some subtle cognitive stuff going on because they did just get the bedside screens, or in the neurology office or in the speech and language office, they get these very brief cognitive tests, that are just very general, that aren't necessarily normed appropriately. So what I mean by that is, there's a difference if you take a 5-minute memory test, if you have a high school education or if you have a master's degree. I mean, education typically makes you more aware of things like vocabulary words, and you get pushed in a certain way to do higher level academic work, and so your brain does become a little bit different and you're able to remember and organize on the whole a little bit more. And so if we don't take into account education, sometimes we're underestimating people's genuine functioning, or we're underestimating. So it's very easy with these cognitive screening measures to either think someone's fine when really for them, they were used to functioning at a superior or a high average level. And it's very easy to say, well, your functioning now is average. That's average. That's okay. But for that person, that is not average, And so it's very important that we don't hold up a one-size-fits-all cognitive testing model, right? And so the things after stroke that are so visible, like a hemiparesis, an arm that doesn't work properly, that seems to kind of steal the show. It gets all the attention. And some people don't even know that maybe there are these higher level cognitive issues just because they don't get to really see a specialist. Neuropsychologists do have a lot of overlap with speech and language pathologists. They're definitely our closest care partner. But there is a little bit of a difference that I think is important for people to know. One is that their evaluations are a little bit briefer and tend to be focused within the domain that the person, is struggling with. So let's say, attention or language. We're trying to take into account that, this is the psychology part of what we do. We have to also understand mood and behavior, depression, anxiety, these things. In a speech and language eval, those things aren't necessarily getting considered. And so sometimes people have memory problems because it relates to their depression. So we like to think that we're a little bit more comprehensive. So what I think is critical for self-advocacy after a stroke is to say that you want to see a neuropsychologist. I think that it's really an evaluation that people deserve, even if it's a one-time thing. You have this baseline that you can go on and do your therapies and come back and compare your recovered performances compared to how you were right after the stroke. But we also might find, other risk factors based on the fact that our evaluations take, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours. Some of it involves you as the person doing our testing, but a lot of it is our behind the scenes work where we get all your medical records. Really, we're kind of like, we like to go through, medical records and figure out, well, why did someone have the stroke? Just because you've had a stroke doesn't mean that you're not at risk for having another type of issue that affects brain health, like obstructive sleep apnea or I guess what I'm just trying to say is it's so important not to reduce people just down to one dimension, which is having had a stroke. People still have a right to be a complex psychological and medical being above and beyond just the stroke.
Right. And I think one of the things that's also really interesting too, and I talked about this with Whitney as well, is that I'd be interested in understanding from folks around the world if they encounter this as well. But I know in the United States, we do have there's an anti-intellectual current that runs through the culture. an opposition to the eggheads, and, being seen as smart is not necessarily seen as a positive in a lot of contexts, which I think gets the other question, which you brushed against there, which is the whole, is it the obligation of the medical field and the insurance field and the government provided healthcare resources to return somebody to as close to where they were before their stroke, or just to get them up to the average level of functioning? And is it appropriate? And I think there'd be a lot of pushback to the idea of, oh, you were not average before. What makes you think you deserve us to spend money on your care to get you anywhere above average?
Yeah, right. I would say, part of the job of doctors is to make sure that they're respecting each person's uniqueness and what's of value to that person. And so if someone was, superior intelligence before their stroke, if they come in and they say, it's very important to me to get my memory as good back as I can, that to me is just as valuable as somebody who was a, professional tennis player who says, I want to come in and I want to return to playing tennis, But I think the truth is that the medical system is not able to provide us with this. And this is why we need to empower individuals to maximize the medical system for what it's worth, know the system, learn how to work within the system. But I think people are also going to have to be their own guide for their own recovery. And, thank God we live in a time where there's podcasts like this, and, we have doctors that we can get good quality information from on YouTube, because I can't even imagine the struggle people have had in years past trying to piece together care, but it takes a certain kind of personality to feel like you can push back on doctors to get answers. And that was another part of our recovery guide, was really empowering people with the tools of advocacy, giving them scripts. How do you go in and you don't want to alienate the doctor, but we also can't just go in there and think that they live our life, and that, in our 7 to 8 minutes of follow-up time with them, that they're going to be mind readers and they're going to know what's on our mind. And so it's really important, I think, to train the public of how to go to a doctor's appointment nowadays. And when you have a brain health challenge, it makes all that organizational preparation even that much harder. And so we wanted to make sure in the guide that we were giving people kind of step-by-step scripts to be able to go in and say, this is what's important to me. These are my recovery goals. Who are the local experts that, specialize in this, and to not take no for an answer, and to not let it just be, well, I've used my 8 to 10 insurance covered rehab therapies. I guess this is as good as I'm going to get, because that's not congruent with science. It's not a coincidence that people have this stereotype that stroke recovery only goes on for a year. I think it's because we only give people therapy for at most a year. I think if the mandate was that we give people therapy for 5 years, the science would tell us people keep getting better at 5 years, because it has everything to do with repetition and novelty. And, if you're just going to accept that that's as good as you're going to get, you're not going to make the best recovery you can. And so we wanted to have one guide where all of the cutting edge information about what you can really do to recover your damaged brain at the biological level, at the psychological level, it needed to all be in one guide, not just trying to go to your doctors and piece it together yourself. Because I think that's just really unnecessary. That's like why there is the benefit of the Facebook groups, is hopefully people aren't out there inventing the wheel, and what worked for one person might save someone else some time and effort.
Absolutely. The studies most of the studies don't say recovery stops at 12 months. Most of the studies just say, oh, we never looked past 12 months.
Right, exactly. And then the stereotype that trickles down to people is this feeling like, oh, it stops at one. It's almost like we infer, well, if they're not doing more
Yeah.
therapy, it must be that I don't have the ability to get better. And it also has to do with what are the markers of success that rehab professionals use, because their client, the payer, is the insurance companies. And so, if you don't make any, quote, progress within a certain number of sessions, they basically decide that you've reached your plateau. This is your maximum rehab potential. But we don't really have a system for paying for maybe a different kind of treatment, or maybe coming at it a little bit of a different way. It's very cookie cutter, unfortunately. And we rely on the big heart and the good graces of our rehab professionals. But it's not systematic enough. Neuropsychologists, it's not built in enough to the budgets. It's just, if you're lucky and you get an awesome therapist, then cool, they'll go above and beyond for you and you'll get better than the average person. But I think it needs to be built more into the fabric of the programs.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I found to be particularly valuable, all of my occupational therapists have been great, but I found tremendous value and would make leaps in progress when I changed OT. Just by going to a different therapist, just because, even if they're following the same standards of care, everybody brings their own personal approach and it makes a difference.
Exactly. And it's the novel stimulation you get. I mean, so much of what the brain wants and what it thrives on is uniqueness, is novelty. And that's why it's so important that we, find that balance between the structure of a good routine and doing the same thing at the same time every day, but also making sure we keep stimulating the brain with new things. And the way people interact with us, I often joke and say, if you want a brain game, go have a conversation with a new person, because that's really the stimulation that our brain craves. We are a very social animal, and our brain was absolutely designed for face-to-face social interactions. And so that's never going to be able to be replicated in, a game or doing the same thing over and over again. We always have to try to figure out a new, novel way to get more input into our brain.
Absolutely. And that novelty is important, along with leveraging that right familiarity, because you also talk in the book about using things familiar to a patient to help with their recovery. I remember your example of the golf ball. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that relates to the whole idea of novelty and familiarity and balancing that?
Definitely, yeah. So like I said in the book, it's really based around the 10 rules of rehab. And the second rule is build on what's familiar. And the idea there is that, a stroke is a focal injury. We never want to forget that the whole rest of the brain is just as healthy as it was prior to the stroke. And so we have a lot of residual strengths to leverage in order to get that damaged area, back on board and help with compensatory strategies. So the way the whole brain was built is based on what it's been exposed to. So our hobbies, our interests, our life, the people we care about, right? And the world is represented in the brain in a series of networks. And these networks are, groups of neurons that exist in all different widely distributed parts of the brain. So, taking that example of golf, there's a part of your brain that is involved with the spatial part of how you hold the golf club and how you hit the golf ball. There's also memories in your brain that may have to do, when you got your first hole-in-one or the time you went out with your grandpa and played golf. There's also the way the golf ball smell when it comes out of the container. There's memories of watching it on television. The clothes that we went out and bought to do, golfing in. And so all of that is in different parts of the brain. You got parietal lobe there, frontal lobe, memories are stored all over, abilities are stored all over. And so the idea is if we have a stroke in one part of the brain, it's kind of damaging maybe one node in the network, but we've got this whole rest of the network that is there and intact. And so if we don't personalize rehab therapies and just assume that everybody wants to hold the same pink, stress ball to get their hand back, we're missing a big opportunity to recruit these other parts of the brain, the remaining part of the network, to be able to support the recovery. We also know that the more emotionally attached we are to things in the environment, the more personally we're interested in things, the more we're able to call in our limbic system, which is the emotional centers in the brain. And that can help support other types of functioning. So with aphasia, that's the perfect example. And so, sometimes if someone with aphasia is having a hard time talking and they get really upset about something, all of a sudden their words start to come out with a lot more fluency. And we think it's because you kind of get this like power boost from the limbic system, that it kind of gives an extra level of energy or fuel to the brain. So we want to make sure we're making things as interesting for people, but personalizing the intervention. So, it's really important to incorporate things people always loved before, even from types of music to, sports and hobbies, even, people having pictures in their room of family, of celebrities that they used to like, their favorite band, making sure that the reinforcements are built on things that are personally meaningful to that person. Because, it's almost like this secret weapon that you have. I mean, your brain is already organized around all of those interests. And so if we can recruit them, you're going to be able to get a stronger result. And so that's what we really care about, is making sure that we're not just all of a sudden seeing people in a stroke unit and just treating them, like I said before, as, well, this person had a stroke and now we're just treating stroke. No, this is Bill. Bill did this before his stroke. So how is it that we can bring more of Bill into this recovery? Not only because that will be psychologically comforting to Bill, but because that's how his brain was organized before. So we don't want to start something all new when we're trying to rebuild. We want to try to build on to what's already there.
Fantastic. And I think if you want to hear an example of that in someone living with aphasia, if you go back and listen to last week's episode where I interviewed Paul Sanders, as we go through that interview, you can hear the things he is really passionate about and has deeper expertise in. His speech becomes much more fluid and much smoother as he goes through those types of discussions. And it's interesting to watch how that goes through the discussion there.
Right. Isn't that amazing? I mean, that was one of the best things I learned working in the inpatient rehab unit at UNC was there was a young man who was in there, and he actually had a abscessed tooth, and unfortunately the infection went to his brain, and it was touch and go for a while. We really didn't know if he was going to be able to survive. And he, as the psychologist, I had a chance to go in and talk to him, and he was just talking about being so bored. He was just bored out of his mind, and he just didn't feel like he was interested in the rehab therapy. So we started asking, well, what would you do if you were home? And he said, I would be playing my Xbox. And so we were able to get an Xbox and get it into his hospital room. And all of his therapists then made the Xbox part of rehab, whether it was, if you come and, walk with me 500 feet, you're going to get to come back and have 45 minutes on the Xbox. Or the occupational therapist was there getting him different joysticks, different controllers. And so he was motivated to want to do the game because he liked the game, but he's also getting a therapeutic benefit out of actually having to work his hand, and it's really just such common sense, but it's amazing how things get mucked up when you work in a system like a hospital system, because you wouldn't believe how much we had to fight to get that kid his Xbox. Well, could another patient ever use it after this? How would we autoclave it? And it's like, at the end of the day, we were all ready to say, look, we'll buy the kid his own Xbox. This is this kid's life. This is his whole entire existence while he's here dealing with this horrible brain infection and, touch and go on life and death, whatever it takes to get him to feel like he wants to keep going.
It's amazing how those things and those priorities really come into play and make that difference. And, we've been talking a lot here about recovery and trying to live with these things. One of the key things you talk about in the book as well is trying to acknowledge the difference between giving up and accepting your new life. I know a lot of folks struggle with that. What does that really mean?
Yeah, it's kind of like they don't have to be mutually exclusive. I think if you start to throw around the word acceptance, what people hear is, you mean I have to accept the way I am today and nothing's ever going to change. Whereas that's not really what we mean by it. There's so much in popular messages about stroke recovery, even the words we use like warrior, fighter, survivor, it's this idea that, your recovery is really based on the tenacity of how hard you fight back. And so it's almost like there's no room for language about the surrender, the acceptance, the giving in, the making space, the working with. And so what I'm trying to say is I think you can do both. You can be just as focused on getting the function of a limb back as you are accepting that, you may not be able to wear laced sneakers ever again. You may have to go to Velcro shoes. There's a way that you can put as much energy into both of those goals. And I think that it's partially because we don't really teach people how to acknowledge the trauma and the grief that can go along with having a stroke. I mean, finally, we know that people can really have post-traumatic stress disorder after a stroke. When the whole idea of PTSD came out, it was, okay, well, only if you're someone who's lived through a war. Then it got expanded to, okay, well, if you've been raped. Then it was, well, if you have a cancer diagnosis, right? And so now what we know is that trauma is universal. And for all of us, when an unexpected life-threatening event happens, we have a very normal human response, which is that we go through typical phases, which include shock, disbelief, anger, bargaining, and ultimately we hope we wind up at acceptance. And then really the final phase is being able to use your own experience to lessen the pain of someone else, right? Which is part of what you're doing. People who go to stroke units once they have recovered nicely and go back and try to help people, someone who's walking in those same shoes. But we don't really talk enough about acceptance is the final frontier. There's a lot of phases, the angry phase, the bargaining phase, wishing, God, why didn't I stop smoking? Or why didn't I treat my blood pressure more seriously before? And some of those phases are harder. And that's why, too, in the guide, it was very important for us that we, give people some journaling prompts to really think about how is it that this trauma has affected my feeling of safety in the world, my feeling of being able to trust my own body, my confidence to get things done, basic questions of what have I lost as a person? And so once you go through those questions and you figure out what it means for you, and then you grieve and you face the fear that you felt and you face the loss and maybe for some people some embarrassment. That's the only way we can get through to that acceptance. So I think that's part of why acceptance feels so far away for a lot of people, is we're just not helping people understand the steps they would have to take to actually get to that place. And so I was lucky enough to train in a veterans hospital for my internship and my postdoctoral fellowship. So I was around a lot of soldiers with PTSD. And so basically what I tried to do is map on what I know about PTSD in that context to stroke. And it doesn't really get written enough about, but like I said, trauma is trauma no matter what the cause. And we have to, it's not necessarily the details of the trauma that damage us psychologically over time. It's how the trauma impacted the way we feel about ourselves, other people, or the world. And so you often hear people make global negative statements after a trauma, like, all people suck, or the world's awful, or things are never going to get better. And that's usually an indication that there's been some global negative impact from the trauma. And so again, if we don't have psychologists involved with stroke recovery, I'm worried that people might be saying some occupational therapy, but if no one is trained to know how to listen, then we're not ever going to be able to get in there and work on balancing some of that thinking and giving people more of a accurate representation, right? Because that's just a cognitive distortion. Nothing is really all negative or all positive. There's little bits in each camp, right? And so that's part of cognitive behavioral psychology, is to just help people take away their distortion, their lens, and to see something for what it really is. And that's where the healing is, and that's how you get to the acceptance.
Wow, there's a lot more there than folks generally think.
Yeah, exactly. And PTSD, has a lot of cognitive symptoms. Like you can't pay full attention to something if internally you're managing triggers. And, we know, triggers. How many of us hate to go to the dentist because of a bad experience, right? It's the smell when you walk in. It's the white coat. It's the needles. It's all that. So I would imagine for folks with stroke, there's a lot of internal triggers that people are monitoring all the time. And what I mean by that is, how did you feel in those moments before you had your stroke? Some of that can be just part of normal sensation of being alive, right? So maybe a little bit of pins and needles or a headache or, feeling a little bit dizzy. For people who've had a stroke, that's a lot to manage to then go on and live a life in a body where you're going to get those kind of pings all the time. So, how is it that you can learn to manage those sensations without being so hypervigilant that you can't get anything else done? So often what I find is that there's a layer of psychological recovery that's not being attended to, that's making cognitive functioning worse.
Right, which then means you're also spending more energy, you're spending more spoons to process this, even if you don't realize it. And when you're already at higher risk for neurofatigue and just trying to contend with everything else, that puts an extra burden on your brain that is really not going to be helping you.
Right, exactly. And if there's no one in the, it's that whole invisible disability thing. And neurofatigue is so real and is so beyond, I think, what any of us who haven't had a stroke can imagine. But I've had people in my office in the weeks after stroke, and it's like, you can just see, it's like they're walking through quicksand. It's really heart-wrenching because it's this, like, even if I went and took a nap, like that's not what's going to make this feel better. The brain is just having such a hard time. It's having to work so hard to do some basic things. And if one of those things is, suppressing triggers, it's like you said, it's just going to keep contributing to the neurofatigue. And maybe we're going to keep chalking it back up to stroke when really there's a treatable layer of anxiety or adjustment that if we knew we could focus on, people would feel better.
Right. I sometimes describe neurofatigue as, how for most people, it's like your cell phone that just gradually declines in battery life through the day, 60, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10, 15, 5, and it's done. With neurofatigue, it goes 70, 60, 50, 40, 10, 5, done.
Right. That's
and just sort of drops off like that.
Right.
So, I mean, what's the next step for you? What's the next step in this evolution of this process of evangelizing the work that you're doing?
Our goal right now that we have the stroke recovery guide out finally after 2 years, it was really fun in the summer when it came out to transition into a different mode, which is getting it out there to people. So we have it for sale on our website, icareforyourbrain.com/guide. And we worked hard to get it to be a price that was affordable. We were able to get a grant from a local organization called the Foundation of First Health, and they helped us with printing the first edition. And for their help, they were given 2,000 copies of the guide. So everyone in our community who leaves our primary stroke center or our rehab center is going to get a copy of the guide, which is awesome. And so what we want to do is get it into the hands of as many people as possible. So it's on Amazon.com. We have it on our website. Like I said, $27 for the hard copy, $17 for the digital download. And what we really want to do is get it into more hospitals, more stroke centers, more rehab centers, because the information is really make or break. And I worry that just through not having access to high quality information that people aren't getting as well as they possibly can. And to get well after a stroke, you need a neuropsychological approach. You have to understand all this high level neuroplasticity stuff and the nuts and bolts of what to do. But we also have to respect the psychological part of our being, which is we've been through a traumatic event and life may be different on the other side. And how is it that we acknowledge those changes and adapt and learn to, of course, thrive in the face of the challenges? So I'm worried without access to both sides of the house that people's recovery will be incomplete because it's imbalanced. All I care about right now is getting this information out to as many people as possible. On our Facebook page, I Care for Your Brain with Dr. Sullivan, we do free brain health lectures on there. We have about 100 that are in the archives. So they're also uploaded to YouTube. So we have all sorts of information on there about brain health in general, but also specific strokes, thalamic strokes, basal ganglia, cerebellar, brainstem. Any of your listeners out there, please check the archives. It's totally free. There's literally thousands of hours at this point of high quality science-based information on there. And the idea is, twofold. You have a right to know as much information about your brain as your doctors do. And I'm just afraid we're not going to get it if we rely on the medical system to get you that information. And number two is the information is fuel for your recovery. You'll do things different. You'll think about yourself different. You'll think about your recovery different if you know differently, right? And so if it's just a matter of getting people better information, then it's really my job to get that information out there. So it's really an access issue for us at this point, just trying to spread the word.
Awesome. And we will have all those links over on the show notes over at strokecast.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today, Bill. And you're doing such a service to the stroke community with your podcast. I think it's really, really high quality stuff that you're doing. And I think you're perfectly suited to do it.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for being on the show this week. I have taken way too much of your time, and I very much appreciate it.
Oh, thanks. It was my pleasure, Bill.
And that brings us to our hack of the week.
Know thyself, which is to become an expert in your personal stroke. Even people who are pretty savvy with stroke stuff, if I ask them, where was your stroke? A lot of people don't know. And I really try to support people becoming experts in their personal stroke, risk factor, what exactly happened. But I think, remembering the distinction between brain and mind is really powerful. And remembering that the stroke was a structural event that happened to your brain that I don't believe affects the mind. And so the mind has the power to visualize, the mind has the ability to think positively, and you really have to harness those systems if you're going to get as well as you possibly could. So just as one example with hemiparesis, remembering that when we imagine ourselves doing something, so using our hand perfectly well, the same part of the brain is being activated than if you actually did it. So you can imagine, whether it's talking fluently when you have aphasia, using the hand, walking without any dizziness, if you imagine vividly yourself doing those things, that really is a form of rehab. You don't have to pay anyone to do that. You don't need a rehab therapist by your side to do those things. You have that power within your own mind. So, we don't want to set people up for unrealistic expectations and imagine yourself, running a marathon. What we want to try to do is get you to visualize the next realistic step in the recovery chain. And that's why the number one rule of rehab in the book is make your map. You have to know exactly where it is you are right now and what is that very next step. Stroke recovery can happen, as you know, I'm sure, Bill, in leaps and bounds. It can happen in baby steps. It can happen like stairs where it feels like it's flat and then, maybe I got a little bit better. So what you have to do is tune into your, specific deficit and figure out what would be you're not going to go from having a clenched hand that has super high tone to all of a sudden buttoning a button, right? Maybe the next step would be that you're able to flex your hand a little bit more, that maybe you're able to go through the fingers and be able to push down a little bit on each specific finger. Whatever it is that next step is, run through that in your mind over and over again. Imagine yourself doing it, see it, smell it, try as much as you can to feel it. And all of that, all those brain cells that are responsible for doing that in real life are going to get activated, and that is going to move you closer to getting that function back. But so often, it's kind of like the same message in a lot of what I'm saying. We focus so much on the visible that we forget that we also have this amazing human potential in our mind to, work really hard on the internal things that are big contributors to getting better. So, using that power of visualization, I think, is something a lot of people need to do more of.
If you want to learn more about Dr. Sullivan's fascinating and non-traditional childhood and the Bon Jovi connection, listen to episode 65 of the Neuro Nerds podcast. You may remember the Neuro Nerds from episode 65 of this show, and that is actually quite the unexpected coincidence there that they're both episode 65. Back in that episode is when I talked with Neuro Nerd host Joe Borges. And this brings up another important point. Don't be afraid to tell your story. Just because you think that, quote-unquote, everybody has already told theirs. Joe and his co-host Lauren started the Neuro Nerds podcast just a couple of weeks after I started the Strokecast podcast, and we didn't know anything about each other at the time. But the thing is, we're not competitors. We're all colleagues and brain buddies. Each show is different and brings something different and valuable, I hope, to the community. You see, the interview that Joe did with Dr. Sullivan is fantastic, and it's very different from the conversation you just heard between me and Dr. Sullivan. Joe and I have also both interviewed Sarah, Tamsin, and Angie, the fantastic and delightful three Stromies, about their efforts to share stories and bring value to the stroke survivor community through their social media presence and their ongoing blog. And, of course, those conversations that I had with the Stromies and that Joe had with the Stromies and that the Stromies have with other survivors, those are all very different. Christine Lee and Ted Baxter have both written stroke memoirs and been guests on this show. And those books and conversations are all very different. They're also, of course, very different from the books written by Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor and Allison Shapiro. And they're different from the books and stories you'll hear about in the coming weeks. The point is that if you want to tell your story, don't think there are already too many stroke podcasts or too many stroke blogs or too many stroke YouTube channels or too many stroke books, because none of them have you. Your unique perspective and your unique history and your unique personal point of view. So go out and do it. And if you do, let me know, because I want to check it out and share it with the community here. So check out Dr. Karen Sullivan's Facebook Live videos and the Interactive Stroke Recovery Guide. You can find all those links and more over at strokecast.com/Karen. Have you talked with a neuropsychologist as part of your own recovery? Might be a good idea to look for one in your area and see if the support from that professional is right for you and if you need to add a neuropsychologist to your ongoing care team. And of course, I'd appreciate it if you can do me a favor and share this episode with 3 people that you know, or share it on your own social media platform by giving folks the link strokecast.com/Karen. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you soon.
The Strokecast, Bill Monroe, and Bill's guests provide general information and entertainment, not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting your personal doctor or medical team. The Strokecast is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.